Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported, independent media. Please pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Follow on Twitter at aroundtheempire, and please help me build up the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Journalist Zaid Jilani joins the show to talk about the ideological differences in the Democratic Party, which have been on display in a recent public feud between the Bernie Sanders campaign and Neera Tanden, the leader of the Democratic Party think tank, the Center for American Progress, or CAP. Jilani draws on his experience working at CAP for several years to help analyze the deep divide. We talked about how flooding the field with a large number of primary candidates might be used as a strategy to undermine Bernie Sanders. And lastly, we discussed Russiagate and the politics of impeachment. Zaid Jilani is a journalist from Atlanta, Georgia, currently a writing fellow for the University of California, Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. He's previously worked as a reporter and blogger for Think Progress, which is part of Center for American Progress, and for other political organizations and media outlets. And he's the co-host of the Extremely Offline podcast. We recorded this on April 20th, 2019. Hey, Zaid, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, no problem, Joanne. It's great to be here.
So I was just saying to Zaid that we've known each other online and interacted for a long time, but I think this is the first time we ever sort of met, not in person, but, talked via voice rather than typing. And that's kind of interesting that how many people you know online, but, you've never interacted with them other than that. So to just kind of set this up, from the stats, I can see that the listeners of this podcast, about more than half are American, but there's a large percentage of international listeners as well, and not just European. So just for context. And I don't mean to say that they're not interested in American presidential elections, just that they may not be in the weeds on the details of things. But most people in the world are interested in these elections, I'm pretty sure, because they affect almost everybody in one way or another. And the kinds of issues and the sentiments that we're going to talk about today are widespread. They're not just American. So how about if we set this up by giving some context? What led me to invite Zaid here today is a kind of epic thread that he did on Twitter, sparked by a recent flare-up between the Bernie faction and what we'd call the establishment faction in the Democratic Party. And that's to describe it narrowly, because as Zaid will explain, it's much bigger than that. And he also wrote an article about the subject too. And I'll link to both of those in the show notes. So Zaid, let's sort of summarize what happened, plus a little bit of the history. And then after that, we can get into the bigger picture of what's really going on. Or actually, let me read the first few paragraphs of your article, because that'll sort of save you having to explain. Let me just do that. Is that okay with you if I read part of your article?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay. So the title of the article is Bernie Sanders is Right. Money Always Corrupts. Will the liberal establishment listen? Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders raised eyebrows in mid-April when he launched a significant salvo against the Center for American Project, CAP, a liberal DC think tank. Sanders was incensed by a video produced by the think tank's weblog, Think Progress, that highlighted the senator's growing wealth following the success of a 2016 book. He responded by writing to the think tank's board, excoriating them for the video, while informing his massive email list about the reality that CAP is funded by numerous corporations and foreign governments opposed to his agenda. The ties between CAP and Sanders don't end there. Sanders' campaign manager is Fez Shakir, the former editor-in-chief of Think Progress and a CAP alumni. Sanders also recently hired David Sirota, another CAP alum, who served as a speechwriter in the 1990s. As the New York Times reported, the bad blood between Shakir and CAP President Neera Tanden goes back more than a decade. In 2008, she either punched or shoved Shakir, depending on whose story you believe, after he asked a critical question about the Iraq War to her then boss, Hillary Clinton. It would be easy to write all this off as an interpersonal clash of personalities. A thin skinned senator lashing out at a think tank run by a former nemesis of his campaign manager. But it goes much deeper than that. I know because I worked under both Shakir and Tandem when I was a blogger at Think Progress between 2009 and 2012. During that time, I clashed with CAP's leadership about various issues and also witnessed disputes between Shakir and Tandem firsthand. Not a single one of these disputes was about personality. Whether someone got passed over for a promotion, for instance, they were all about ideology. So I think that sets it up pretty well. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think that there were two strands of kind of reporting about this, and I think both of them are interesting and compelling in some ways. I mean, I think that the first strand is to say that this was a kind of a long-held kind of personal dispute between personnel at the Center for American Progress, Bernie Sanders and some of his staff, some of whom worked at Center for American Progress. And I think in terms of a human interest piece, that is somewhat interesting to realize that Shakir, previously worked at this institution where the top brass and leadership are fairly hostile to Bernie Sanders and his politics, and kind of the interpersonal dispute there. But I think there's a larger, kind of more compelling strand, and I think this will be interesting to your listeners. It'll be interesting to people abroad as well, because I think we see similar kind of political disputes in other countries, other democratic
Right.
countries, which is that the Center for American Progress and Bernie Sanders, I think they have a fundamental disagreement on an ideological basis, which is that the Center for American Progress basically operates as like a second White House. When I worked there, it was under the Obama administration. They were constantly in touch with folks in the administration. They were lobbying the administration as well as lobbying members of Congress on various issues. And I think a lot of people at Center for American Progress also went and worked for President Obama, or they had anticipated they would work for Hillary Clinton had she won the presidency. So it kind of operates as a very political operation. I think when people think about think tanks, they think, oh, it's some people sitting around talking philosophy or researching policy. Maybe there's a little bit of that. But a lot of this also is an operation based on getting into government. And I think their understanding, at least the people who lead CAP, their understanding of politics and governance is that there's a lot of powerful stakeholders. Many of them spend a lot of money, like businesses. There's also foreign governments that are involved in trying to influence the U.S. government. And then interacting with all these actors is kind of part and parcel of being involved in government, including sometimes taking financing from them, making them part of your political coalition when you're writing legislation, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's generally how the Obama administration viewed the role of money in politics, and I think that's how people at CAP viewed it. Now, I think Bernie Sanders has a different view. Bernie Sanders kind of says that if you take money from certain corporations, if you take them from foreign governments, etc., that influences how you interact with the policymaking process. It makes you kind of tilted towards those interests. It makes you feel like you have to please them to some extent to keep the monetary relationship going. And, I think sometimes Bernie Sanders is portrayed as being self-righteous or overly moralistic because he takes his point of view, but actually he may be the opposite. I think that when, I've interviewed many politicians about money in politics or talked to many people over the years about money in politics, and or at least just read other people doing it as well. And I think almost to a person, almost every single person will say, well, it doesn't impact us. It's not a big deal. People giving us money just want good government, et cetera, et cetera. I think Bernie Sanders isn't so much claiming that he's above that. I think he's claiming that he is vulnerable to that. He does think that if he were to fundraise with super PACs, or super PACs were fundraising for him because they're not technically allowed to coordinate. If he was financing himself through corporate donations, if he was doing all this, he thinks that he would be influenced by it. So he's kind of acknowledging almost like a weakness in his personality.
Yeah, and he's
But
been in the Senate for what, 30 years, so it's
yeah, I
almost
mean, he
impossible that he hasn't had, been impacted by it in some way.
right. So he's almost sort of acknowledging what he sees as sort of almost like a weakness or a human personality flaw that's broad and widespread. So I think honestly his side of the argument to me seems almost a little bit more pragmatic because he's saying that if you do end up raising a lot of this money, taking a lot of this money, it will impact the way that you govern and that you address political issues of concern. And I think that the opposition, the other side, which is I guess led by Cap in this case, is sort of arguing that you can have this massive fundraising with industry and that it won't necessarily impact you all that much.
That is a
Uh,
very interesting point you're making there, and really insightful, I think. You're saying that Bernie's saying even the best people, it's inevitable. They can't avoid that kind of influence. Whereas the Neera Tanden faction, let's just call it that, or the establishment, they have more confidence in themselves. I would say um, delusional confidence. They believe that they're above it all. They that they can, it's an elite attitude. Just and that sort of runs through this whole thing.
yeah, I mean, I think that that's really important in that I think that Sanders is often portrayed as having a very self-righteous attitude or I like he's so above it all or something, but actually I think he's being very humble by conceding that if he were to actually fundraise in a similar way as other politicians, that he would be corruptible. He's saying that he's basically as human as anyone else. And I think that, Elizabeth Warren is doing a similar thing in terms of how she's running her political campaign. She's saying she's not going to do private fundraisers. She's saying, she wants to have a very grassroots oriented campaign. I think she's also just kind of conceding a flaw in herself that she could not possibly fundraise the same way as, let's say, Kamala Harris is doing it, or let's say Mayor Pete or Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, or Joe Biden. She's saying that if she did do the same as them, that she would be vulnerable to influence from this money. And I think Bernie Sanders and Warren are kind of making that point. It's not really a self-righteous point. It's almost like they are just acknowledging this flaw in human psychology. And I think that their opponents actually are making the more idealistic claim, which is that we can spend tons of time, as Neera Tanden's mother, who for some reason was interviewed for the New York Times article, said she spends a lot of time going to rich people and asking them for money. And if you do spend all that time doing that, her side of the argument is basically arguing that you can do that and it won't influence you very much. Uh, Sanders, Warren's side of the argument is saying that if you do that, actually we're all flawed people. It will influence us at some point. So it's actually kind of an interesting way to look at it. I don't think many people actually realize or acknowledge that this view of money. Actually, I think the Sanders one is a little bit more pragmatic than the other one.
Yeah, well, it's kind of what it comes down to, I think, is, am I corruptible or not? And there are some people who believe that they're not corruptible, and others who know that everyone's corruptible, or almost everyone. And you, in one of your tweets from that thread, you say, we have to ask ourselves whether it's possible to have a real discussion about the future of our country's foreign policy when foreign governments and elite interest groups often set policy in secret and outside the purview of transparent debates. That's one of the ones that really jumped out at me. And but I'm glad you brought up the corruptible thing. Now, you were there in 2009 through 12, so that's 10 years ago. That's a pretty good period of time. What was it like when you were there, and have you seen an evolution? Have you seen changes? Has it gotten worse in terms of how much outside influence is exercised on this think tank?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say about the contemporary situation in that, I no longer work there. Although I have done some reporting about some of the contemporary situation there. But I would say when I worked there, it operated not too dissimilar from, I think, everyone else in government in that I think that the people who work there for the most part do have ideas about the world, and they have a thinking about where they want policy to be, and they work hard to try to establish that. But at the same time, in order to keep its operations going, CAP has, it has a fairly large, stable, and set of fundraising from private corporations, from foreign governments, and I think when they are composing that policy, the fundraising side plays a lot of influence. I think that the people who are spending money to finance CAP have a lot of influence and oversight in terms of the policy they're writing. That doesn't mean they just get to dictate it, but certainly I think when they write major policy papers, a lot of the funders also get some input and some access, which is I think very similar to let's say, members of Congress or the president or presidential administrations, which is why I think that in some ways CAP is like a second government. They are, even though they're a private organization, they operate very much like a second government. Now they have made some changes in response to criticism. So first, they didn't disclose their donors. I knew a lot of them because I worked there. I saw a number of times those donors influence kind of CAP's policy agenda in some ways. Uh, Also influence what Think Progress would write sometimes, in that sometimes we would get kind of a scolding that, we upset a donor or something like that. That would happen quite frequently. Um, but I think they have made a few changes. So one is they didn't used to disclose any donors. Uh, Ken Silverstein is a journalist. He wrote some articles for The Nation criticizing some aspects of CAP's donor base based on leaks that he had. After that, they now, I think, do reveal most of the donors. I think you can still give as an individual donor anonymously if you want to, but they do disclose the business donors and foreign governments. I think for the most part they disclose. And then they made a second change, and this second change is related to reporting that I did on them, which is that somebody, we still don't actually know who did this because it's a pretty interesting international story, actually.
Yeah, it is.
Somebody hacked the inbox of the Yahoo email inbox of the ambassador to United Arab Emirates, Yusuf Otaiba, and they spread those emails to a number of press outlets. One of the ones I was working with at one point, The Intercept, got some of those emails. And basically what those emails showed is that UAE was financing CAP, and while they were financing CAP, some of their senior staff, Brian Katulis, who's a senior national security guy over there, was helping them put together junkets to go meet with UAE officials, helping them lobby the Trump administration, giving them advice on how to kind of influence policy. I mean, it really did seem to some extent that he was almost working for the UAE as the UAE was financing CAP. And after I wrote a number of articles about this, I believe some other people had written some articles related to this. And I think particularly after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia, which is UAE's big ally, CAP, I think, realized how bad this looked. And so they announced they're no longer going to take money from the UAE. So that's at least two changes they've made in response to criticism. So just like the government sometimes responds to criticism, I think, think tanks do the exact same thing. However, I do think the larger question that Sanders raises, which is if you continue to fundraise with a number of, people who have an interest in pushing policy a certain way, can you truly be independent? From my time working there, and also from that reporting I did about the UAE, it really didn't seem like that's the case. It doesn't seem possible to be truly independent as long as that's happening. And I've heard from a number of other people who worked at CAP over the years that it was a similar situation for them. They didn't feel independent. They felt like there was just a lot of pressure to toe a certain line sometimes because of these funder considerations and also political considerations. Because you have to remember that a lot of the people who work there want to go on and work in the government, so they want to work in a presidential administration. And I think people in government also put pressure on them sometimes. When I worked there, the Obama administration at one point became really furious about some of the writing I did on Afghanistan. They felt like we were just totally out of sync with them. And so then they kind of got our bosses, like John Podesta, to kind of call us in and say, hey, we're not on the same page here, et cetera, et cetera. And, you can see it from CAP's point of view sometimes. I mean, if you're an institution that's set up to kind of please certain people in government so you can go and work for them and to influence policy, I mean, that's a rational thing to do to some extent. I can give you an example. So Joe Lieberman was still a senator at this point, and we had written a couple of critical blog posts about him. I remember I wrote one blog post about him, like asking why Julian Assange hasn't been arrested yet. Well, because he's an Australian citizen, or he wasn't. It's not. It was kind of a silly thing that he said. And Lieberman got so furious at some of our blog posts that he decided to cancel an entire meeting with CAP. And the meeting was about like LGBT issues or like don't ask, don't tell or something like that. Like it was totally unrelated. But Joe Lieberman was so thin-skinned that he decided to do that. And of course, we got some flack from CAP for getting the meeting canceled, even though it was more about his thin skin than it was our writing or anything. But you can see that from their point of view, the kind of pressures they get when you are relying on certain financing and certain political alliances, it's very difficult to be independent. So I think when people who work at Think Progress today say they're independent, I think they're probably more independent than we were because they do have a union now, and that probably helps a little bit. But the reality is, when you're working in the same space and these people are paying your salaries, and it's difficult to be 100% independent. And I think that's true with any publication. It's true with New York Times and Wall Street Journal as well. They have owners who they aren't super free to criticize. But I think what makes CAP a little bit different is that CAP is such a hub of lobbying and financing and influencing, um, that it's kind of difficult when you're in editorial space in there and you really can't oppose the agenda of such an influential and powerful think tank. So I really don't think Progress would be truly independent from CAP unless they actually split off and became a separate entity.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, doesn't it, if they see themselves or if they function like a shadow government or a government in waiting, then, they should be part of the DNC. They should redefine themselves. I mean, they already sort of, everybody knows that CAP is the Democratic Party think tank. So there's that. But not everybody does. It's not in their name. I think there's a big conflict in what they're pretending to be and what they really are.
yeah, I mean, it's true that like CAP has 501c3 status, meaning they're not supposed to be explicitly political. Although they also have a 501c4 branch, CAP Action, which is allowed to be a little bit more political, although they're not supposed to endorse people. I think is the rule. So it is definitely kind of a contradiction in terms of what we think about think tanks as they classically exist to be. Like I don't think like the Cato Institute, for instance, is trying to always get its people in administrations or align with a political party. So Cato would maybe be considered to be a little bit more towards a classical think tank as we imagine them to be. Although they also have a lot of funders, and I'm sure funders do have some influence because it's basically true with any think tank that has a lot of
Yeah.
funders. Um, but yeah, it's difficult. But I kind of I've never worked at Heritage Foundation. I don't know anyone who works there really. If I really rack my brain, maybe I've met someone who's worked there. I think maybe I had one friend who was there for a while. But I kind of imagine they're the same way. I kind of imagine that they also have a lot of pressures to say, hey, we don't want to go too hard on the Trump administration because we still want them to give us meetings and we still want to influence policy and et cetera, et cetera. So I understand that there is this like you said, like we would not be surprised or shocked if the DNC was behaving this way because they're the Democratic Party. Of course, that's their team and they're working to support their team. It does get a little bit more difficult when think tanks become so politicized. Um, but it's almost become like a norm now.
Yeah, it
CAP does
has.
this with the Democratic side for the most part, and then Heritage does this with the Republican side for the most part. Um, I
Yeah, we
do
shouldn't
think,
just pick on Cap about this because it's not
of
just
course,
them. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I know a lot about it because I worked there. I had a lot of friends there. So I can kind of speak to that more. But I definitely don't think it's an exclusive issue to CAP, and that's why I wrote the article. In that I think it's a larger kind of ideological question in politics in general. I think that this question will keep coming up in different contexts with different think tanks and different campaign operations and government, which is, can you really be as independent as you need to be as long as these financial links are there?
Yeah.
And I Sanders generally says no, and I would generally agree with him given my experience. But I think that a lot of the people on the other side of this question, they just think that this is how it's always run. It's not particularly unusual to them. I don't think they find it to be all that strange or unethical. But I think Sanders has a different view, and I think that that view is going to loom very large over the presidential race over the next year. I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I think he sees it as a core problem, just like I see the the war machine, if you will, that whole section of our economy and so on. I think that that is a root cause, core problem, and I think Sanders he doesn't focus as much on that. He focuses more on you know, the corporate and the big donor problem that has just completely corrupted our government. And I do think that it has gotten progressively worse. But there's an interesting tension because up until 2016, it was considered settled law that the candidate that raises more money wins. And in fact, I just noticed Noam Chomsky used to say this all the time. I heard him say it numerous times. But the most recent thing I heard from him, he's starting to modify that claim. He says like most of the time. the
Mm.
person with more money wins. Whereas before he used to say like it was an absolute. So 2016, Bernie, one of the biggest things that Bernie did was to show that you could crowdfund a campaign. And, I think that's one of the underlying things here, tensions that is beneath this flare up that we just saw. This flare up that, as Zed, wisely says, it's much bigger than this personality conflict that a lot of people are, superficially painting it as that, but it's really not. It's a much bigger issue. It's a much deeper issue. And part of the flare up, in my view, is that Bernie Sanders did do that. And I think it was easy to sort of keep people in line if you could just get them to accept that settled law that, look, we don't like this, we're good people, but the person with the more money wins. The candidate with more money wins. And I think everybody just kind of accepted that. Bernie just kind of blew that out of the water. And now the people who rely on that, the establishment, if you will, they don't necessarily represent a larger number of people, a larger percent of the population. So I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but I think uh, that's another thing that underlies this whole flare up. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the question of how politics is done in general is really interesting because obviously, as time goes along, politics is very different in the sense that we have new technology, we have new culture. Certainly, I think if we roll, I wonder actually if you roll back the clock to 2008, how much money President Obama was spending on like web ads, for instance. I know that that was the first campaign where people were seriously using Facebook to organize for him. I think a lot of that was probably done through volunteers, though it wasn't done through the campaign. But I noticed that I think that Sanders is spending the biggest pot of money that he's spending on web advertising and kind of getting people signed up onto his list through the internet, using that to get people to volunteer and do all the things that you do once you have people on your list. So I'm curious, as time goes along, how are people going to conceive of things like having private fundraisers to begin with? You could argue that they're kind of becoming an anachronism at this level because in the past, you're right. The only way that you could raise tons of money was by having people with very high net worths kind of getting into rooms with you and talking to you and pledging $2,700 or whatever. Uh, Sanders kind of showed that in this particular race, he has raised more money than anybody so far. And he did that without doing any private fundraisers or without barely using large donors at all. I think something like 86% or maybe 83% of his money was small donors so far, meaning people who gave less than $200. So he's definitely kind of changed the model in and of itself. And I just, I think that is part of the case in that I think the people who run CAP, I think Neera Tanden, John Podesta, Tom Daschle, these people were all coming of age in politics at a time when small donors played a very small role in the process altogether. I think that their perception was that this is normal because it was normal their entire lives. I think people who came of age watching first President Obama, who had pretty strong small donor share, although not as strong as Sanders, and then watching the Bernie Sanders campaign are thinking, well, why do we even have to do the fundraisers? Why do we even have to have bundlers? Why do we even have to have 501c4s and super PACs helping us? Like, look what Bernie did. So I think that, yeah, part of the larger generational divide on this issue will probably also express itself through the means of people having completely different campaign forms. And yeah, I think that we have a generational divide in the voting we saw in 2016. We'll probably have it again in 2020. And part of that will just be that I think for some people it's completely normal to run politics as it's always been run. And I think for other people, they'll look at what Sanders did in 2016 and what he's doing now, and they'll say, well, why can't we just do it that way instead? And I think that the kind of experience that was lived in 2016 is going to inform a lot of that.
Yeah, from 2016. What I remember is having been on the dissident end for a while now. The enforcer attitude that came from the establishment wing of the party, really kind of bullying you into either guilting and shaming. They love to do that. Like you're this Trump's going to win, or, you're going to wreck the party, all kinds of different things. And they always had this authoritarian enforcer attitude. And I just wonder how well they're going to be able to do that if they have to actually start to take into consideration a more populist view. So, anyway, maybe we sort of did enough on that one. Let me just pick out this other statement that you made here. You said, this is not just about bad blood between Neera Tanden and Fez Shakir. This is about whether we want a democratic, humane society where everybody matters, or an elitist society where only the well connected are considered. So I think you did already kind of sum it up there. It's this, elitist, we know best attitude versus this sort of, I don't know, the masses of people either in the Democratic Party or who have left the Democratic Party, trying to say, you might think you're elite, but you really don't understand the situation. You need to reconsider. And I mean, that's the big question again, is are they going to step down, admit they're wrong and reconsider? So far, I see signs of it. I see some signs of it, but overall, like, I don't. Like with this whole, I guess I have to ask you with this, what you think of the whole Russiagate Mueller report thing. I see a sign of a smaller percentage of people in the Democratic Party saying, all right, leave this behind. We got to move on. Like Bernie being one of them. Bernie, he unfortunately he rumbles on about Russia, 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 but he's clearly trying to focus on the more populist issues. Whereas what seems like the majority of the party just won't let that go. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that they do polling. Um, they do various they do polling. They do various kind of research, looking at where voters are, and I think most voters have not paid a whole lot of attention to this necessarily. Partly because it's gone on for so long. I think that people lose interest in something when it's
Yeah.
gone on for so long. In terms of dealing with the Mueller report and everything, I saw that Elizabeth Warren came out and said that Congress should consider an impeachment process. Probably not because she thinks Trump would be actually removed from impeachment process, but I guess you could argue that doing that offers more room for investigation. Although I would also ask why you can't just investigate everything about Trump with all of the committees you have and all the power you have. Impeachment seems like it's very unlikely. The leadership's not really for it, and I don't know that Americans have seen enough just to say, well, we're going to remove Trump through an impeachment. They'll probably have a process to do that in November with an election in 2020. So, I think that there probably is some kind of political sense for some politicians who are really into this, that associating a president with a kind of unpopular foreign power is some kind of easy win because it's kind of hard to take the other point of view on it. Um, so maybe that's part of why they've driven it so much. I mean, I think on the substance, it's certainly appropriate to investigate everything about President Trump, his overseas businesses, and not just with Russia. I mean, he has so much investment all over the world. And look, I went down to the Trump Hotel one day when I believe it was the UAE, but it was some Gulf country, maybe in Kuwait actually. But one of those countries was hosting an event in the Trump Hotel. Now,
Uh,
President Trump owns that hotel,
yeah, I
uh,
mean,
and it's making a lot of money right now off of all these foreign governments just deciding to hold events there, nice parties there, and spending a lot of money there. I mean, that is certainly something that's inappropriate and worth investigating. And I think particularly when you have a president who has investments everywhere, it's worth looking into, for instance, his tax returns, which is something I think the House Democrats will eventually pursue. Um, and so I think the investigations are appropriate to that regard. I think getting out ahead of the facts of the investigations and suggesting things that just weren't true, like that Trump was just a puppet of Putin, as Hillary Clinton said, and some other people have said, I don't think the evidence really bears that out. He has not acted particularly pro-Russia compared to any other president. He does seem like maybe he has personal affinity. Um,
for strong men.
yeah, I mean, he does, even within the span of U.S. domestic politics, he just seems to like to pick, like he had a lot of generals in his administration because he liked them.
Yeah.
Uh, but he also likes Duterte a lot in Philippines. I don't think anyone claimed that the Philippines has some special power over him, but he likes Sisi in Egypt. He seems to like him. So, I think it's possible that Trump has a personal affinity for Putin. Also, Trump is very easily persuaded by people who flatter him. And he may
That's
think,
it. Yeah.
I think Putin played that game a little bit of trying to flatter him and praise him and say, hey, we didn't like Clinton, we like you. So, that may have been very persuasive over Trump's personality. It didn't take a conspiracy to produce that result. You don't really need a conspiracy to produce that result. We know how Trump kind of operates. So, I don't think there's going to be any grounds for real impeachment. It doesn't seem like you'd be able to get the votes to do that. Certainly, there are grounds to investigate all of Trump's kind of doings because he just has a big business empire, and a lot of governments are pretty obviously trying to influence him through the business empire. I don't think anything is so great about the Trump Hotel that all these foreign governments have to keep hosting events there. There's plenty of nice meeting spaces in D.C. You don't really have to go to that one, but it seems kind of obvious why they're doing it. So I think
Yeah.
that there'd be grounds to continue to investigate him in that regard. But I don't think anybody should expect it to produce some kind of extra legal, or well, it's a legal process, but extra like outside the electoral process of removing Trump. I think Trump will either win the November election or he won't. That'll be how he will leave or he won't. So
Yeah. It seems definitely like the better and maybe even more expeditious option. But because, impeachments don't generally happen that quickly, as far as I know. I think that
I
they,
mean, yeah, I mean, I think the Democrats made this argument under George Bush as well. They said something like, "Well, we can impeach George Bush, or we can just wait for the election." They generally argued it was more expeditious, that it was less politically polarizing. I mean, all that stuff is true. The only caution I would have around that is that sometimes they seem to be talking about impeachment entirely through a political lens, whereas it's part of the Constitution. Like there's a process to remove the president if they committed high crimes and misdemeanors. And I do think it's a little troubling when somebody like, when Nancy Pelosi said we're going to take impeachment off the table with respect to Bush, or when she kind of talks about impeachment towards Trump in the same regard, because it's not really supposed to be a political process. It's supposed to be a recourse that they have, a power that they have. And if you choose not to pursue it, you could just say the reason why is because we don't have the evidence to pursue it. We don't. There's not a clear case for doing it. I don't think that they should be making political cases around this simply because that would send a message that basically to every president, it would send a message that you can get away with whatever you want because we're not going to impeach you because it's politically, one way or another. Whereas it's supposed to be a legal recourse that the Congress has to enforce the idea that the president shouldn't be breaking the law. So that would be my only hesitation on completely dismissing impeachment if I was a member of Congress or anything. But
yeah, I mean, but from my view, it's been almost 100% political from the start, from the day he was elected. I think they were looking for the different mechanisms that you have within the Constitution to first not allow him to even become president, then to try to remove him through whatever 25th Amendment. And first it was the Electoral College, then the 25th Amendment. Then it was just massive, massive pressure to hope he would resign, like Nixon. I mean, they brought Bernstein in. There's a certain faction, it's very clear to me anyway, who had their mind set as a strategy to bring about another Watergate and to have it play out the same way, which was, very foolish and hasn't worked well because now they're in the situation where, you struck the king and you missed. Now they're in that situation. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. One more thing I wanted to ask you about. You have had some, I'm not sure if you've written about it, but you certainly have had some commentary about it, about Tulsi Gabbard as a candidate. What are your thoughts on that? And I guess I'm also kind of hoping that she and Bernie might team up later on. But what do you think about her as a candidate? Recently, I saw someone calling her a sheep herder, like they did with Bernie in 2016. A sheep meaning by sheep herder, they mean sort of like rein in some of the more dissident voters or people not likely to vote and keep them within the party. And then, when the time comes to declare a candidate, that person would have built so much influence with this faction of voters that they could, endorse the nominee and bring all of their black sheep with them, if you will, all of the difficult to get voters. That she's acting in that capacity, and then there have been other people who have had some real issues with her past positions on things, and even her current foreign policy as far as war on terror goes. You have any? You don't have to get into it too much if you don't want to. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I think that she definitely has shifted her politics a little bit. I think when she first got to Congress, she was a little bit more on the right in terms of the Democratic Party. She'd go on Fox News and stuff, and she'd say things like, Obama needs to say radical Islamic terrorism. The fact that he's not saying is ridiculous. She voted on the right on a few things like limiting refugees. She certainly was a little bit closer to the Hindu nationalist right a few years ago in the U.S. People who support the current Indian government and prime minister. So I think that's where she kind of used to be. I think she's moved a little bit after she endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. She's stopped doing a lot of that stuff. That's a little bit more on the right. She's a little bit more left-wing oriented. But she does seem a little bit opportunistic in her politics rather than having kind of a strong center for where she is. Like, you can pretty much always tell where Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are. With Gabbard, she kind of does move around a little bit. So I kind of see the point of view of people who would criticize her in that regard. I just think that criticism should probably be a little bit, it should try to be fair in that I saw some more recent articles about her that are kind of still implying that she has kind of a right-wing political orientation, although I think she's moved a lot.
Yeah, I
Um,
do too.
so I think that's it's fair to make the critique that she was somewhat opportunistic in terms of where she has been moving. But I think you should at least acknowledge the movement because I think she definitely was a little bit more. She was fairly conservative, I think, going back a few years. If you went back to when she was first elected to Congress, yeah, I mean, I think that's totally fair to argue that she, on various social issues, some immigration-related issues, she certainly wasn't very left-wing. But I do think that in the years since, she's become more left-wing. And in terms of her candidacy now, I'm curious about how she would gain any traction or why she would gain any traction. Just because it's a very crowded race of people, and she's running against somebody who she endorsed in 2016 as a rare endorser, who I think is probably going to get the lion's share of that support that maybe she's looking for. Although things are very unpredictable, and you never really know. I don't think that 4 years ago people would be thinking that a mayor from Indiana would be one of the leading candidates now.
Yeah,
Mayor.
that's bizarre to me.
So who knows what could happen? But as of now, I don't necessarily see her getting a lot of traction. But anything can happen too. So
Well, there's an article just this week, I think it was. I live in Norcross district, which is Norcross's brother is a major league political boss, not just in this District 1, New Jersey 1, but really in the whole southern part of the state. And for that reason, they have influence on the whole state. And I won't go into it, but it is a major league machine, right? And there was an article complaining about a tactic that they use, um, even at the county levels. They're doing this when there's a real challenger that comes up to the party, because the party dominates everything here. When a real challenger comes up in a primary, what they do is they flood the whole ticket with what they call phantom candidates. Some of these people weren't even Democrats; they just now registered as Democrats, but they just bring tons and tons of candidates into the, put them on the ticket and on the ballot. And, at the local level, especially, like, ballot placement is really important. So that's what they do to try to counter and just reduce the chances that any sincere challenger, not part of their, in other words, not part of their machine, just to,
well, yeah, I
min-
mean,
it sounds
well,
familiar, doesn't it?
well, the thing is that there is so the rules here actually matter quite a bit in that the rules in the Democratic primary are a little bit different than the Republican presidential primary in that I don't think there are any states that are winner take all, meaning let's say Sanders gets 35% in a state, he wins all the delegates of the state. I don't think that's the rules for any. Whereas in the Republican primary, there are some states that are like that.
So unlike the electoral votes, you mean?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah. Just so people know, we're talking about now is the primaries,
sure.
and they win
Yeah,
certain numbers
right.
of delegates in order to get the nomination. We're not talking about the electoral college where you actually win the election.
So
But
it's an
it's, yeah,
easier
yeah.
so it's an easier possibility in terms of what you were saying that if there are 10 or 12 candidates that someone like Sanders could end up with 30% of the delegates and that is equivalent to a situation where you would have a convention where Sanders may have the plurality, meaning he has the most delegates, but he doesn't have a majority, meaning that the other candidates could have their delegates team up to defeat him, or they could have a different candidate altogether that didn't even run, and that they could just unite around a unity candidate or something. So yeah, that is a threat in this convention in a way that, let's say, it's a little different than how Trump did it in 2016, in that Trump actually didn't even win a majority of the vote, but the rules were so different in the Republican primary that even in a lot of states where he won, I don't know, 40% or something, the rules still gave him all the delegates of that state. So while he didn't win a majority of the vote, he did win a majority of the delegates. So there was really no way to take the Republican nomination away from Trump. Whereas if Sanders wins something like, I don't know, 43% or something, and even if the number two, wins like 30%, there are still ways to take the nomination away from Sanders completely legal to the Democratic Party's rules. So yeah, in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of flooding the candidates, I mean, it does seem to me like the faction of Democrats who don't support Sanders and who want to defeat him are kind of looking for a candidate to do that. They're not really settled on one. It's almost a little bit surprising that they don't seem to have a lot of confidence in Joe Biden to do that.
Right, right.
Even he's leading in polling right now, and he's probably going to have plenty of money. He has very professional staff, a fair bit of fans in the media, I'm sure. They don't even seem to be confident that he can do it. So it seems to me like establishment side of Democratic Party is probably going to be looking hard at Kamala Harris, at Beto O'Rourke, at Mayor Pete, looking at Biden, rather than just putting all their eggs in one basket. So I think what you're describing could very well be how it plays out. I mean, we'll certainly be seeing over the next year.
Yeah, and you could put all this is how you could fight the small donors, right? Put all the big donor money behind a whole bunch of stalking horse candidates and, who they have already pledged ahead of time that they will pledge their delegates to the establishment candidate. And then, of course, we also have, for people who aren't familiar, there's been there's been a major battle ever since 2016 within the party, and the Bernie faction, kind of promised to get some kind of reform, I guess maybe in exchange for not breaking off as a third party, which, by the way, I thought they should have done. They pledged to get some changes within the DNC and within the party, some of the rules, so that this couldn't happen again. And I'm not sure how much they actually got, but what they did get was a concession on the superdelegates. So one, hopefully anyway, the last election, the superdelegates were pledging themselves way ahead of time, and then the media was showing Hillary Clinton as having, some gazillion delegates when really because they were counting the superdelegates. So all along it looked like Hillary was running away with the election when, you know, it was just a misleading way of putting it. So hopefully they won't do that again because the superdelegates, the concession that the Bernie Sanders wing of the party got was that in the first round and during the convention, the first round of delegate counting, the superdelegates don't get a vote. However, they're still there. And if nobody gets a majority in the first round, the second round, the superdelegates do get to cast a vote. So yeah, that's I think this thing is going to go right down to the wire. I'm afraid, but I also think that they're super nervous, like you talked about Biden. Yeah, he's leading in the polls, but so was Hillary Clinton by what what did she have, like a 60% lead or something in the beginning in 2016?
Yeah, I think she was. at or around in the 60s, if I'm remembering correctly.
Very big, anyway. If we're not, yeah, don't quote us, but a very big lead. Oh, over Bernie, actually, she had even more than that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to keep you too long. Anything else that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
Well, I think that folks should just keep, I think they should just feel like going forward. A lot of the cleavages that you and I talked about, I think they're going to be ever present. I've heard some people make arguments like, this was 2016, we don't want to go back to that, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think this is a matter of just Bernie Sanders or just
Mm-hmm.
Hillary Clinton and all the new candidates now. I think these are kind of ever larger questions about American politics and politics elsewhere. I think, in other countries we do see some similarities. So I think that we shouldn't think that we can avoid a lot of these political questions. I think they're just a feature of our politics, as they are really important. These are competing factions competing over some very powerful positions. So I think there's no way to avoid some of these conflicts. And of course, we all want it to try to be civil and measured and constructive, but I think we're going to have the conflicts. I just don't think it's avoidable. So
Right, right. One other thing you brought up is that it's not even, these problems they're not new. They're not just open wounds from 2016. And they're also, you called it, what did you call it? I think you called it a transpartisan issue. And that's really important too. I would urge people to read that part of Zed's Twitter thread and article, because there are people, there are independents in the mix, there are even Republicans in the mix here. So I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we're going to continue to see, and it certainly isn't. It's not limited to any political party or even any country, really. So I think that these questions about how you have a democratic country, where most of the people are getting most of what they want, as opposed to small kind of faction getting what it wants, is, I mean, that's a serious question, and it's something that I think we're going to continue to have to address in this country and elsewhere. So.
All right. So if you would tell everybody where they can find your work, how they can support you, and all of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So right now I'm a fellow at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. So, you can look me up there because I write about social and political polarization, kind of what are the causes of it, what does it look like, what is it doing, and also what are some solutions, like what are some ways to kind of address that. So you can look me up there. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called Extremely Offline that you can listen to on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, et cetera, Stitcher, where we kind of just bring on people from different political tribes to kind of hash things out in kind of a civil, polite manner, but really get deep in some issues. So those are two places that you can kind of look out for my work, and then also I generally post my work onto Twitter when I do freelance writing. So.
Yeah, I really like the way you're approaching that podcast. I think there's a gap there that, oh my God, really needs to be filled,
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Joanne.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Zaid Jilani. Follow Zed on Twitter at Zaid Jilani, ZaidJilani. Subscribe to his podcast, Extremely Offline. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. A special thanks to longtime patrons and also to new patrons this month and contributors, and to everyone who's messaged with suggestions and feedback, kind words and encouragement. It really does make a difference, and I appreciate it. The audio podcast has been the main focus for Around the Empire, where we have the most traffic. There are many ways to listen. Find it, subscribe on your favorite podcast app, or listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video, leave me a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. And as I've said for a couple of months now, I'm working on a new look, some new kinds of content, including video live streams, mini docs, and other things. and I'd really like your help to build up that YouTube channel. Hey, we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Peace.